Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson. And look, for the next couple of days, we're going to be focusing on just one story, the Grenfell Tower fire. The reason is that the inquiry report is out tomorrow. It will, of course, be looking into what and who were responsible for the fire back in June 2017, which ultimately led to 72 deaths. We here on the podcast will be bringing you full coverage of all of its conclusions then, which I imagine will be of interest, not least because there are plenty of residential buildings still clad in that very same flammable material which bedecked Grenfell, and we will be talking much more about that just a little later with our correspondent Becky Johnson. First though, I want us to talk about the children of Grenfell Tower. Those who survived did not do so intact. They carry scars, both physical and mental. Our correspondent Rachael Venables was there on the night of the fire, whilst working for radio station LBC.
When the wind picks up and the greying white smoke moves away from it, I can see straight through to the skeleton of what used to hold 120 homes and now nothing more than twisted black metal beams. There are bits of ash and material flying off sporadically and falling to the ground with sort of popping bangs. And if I look through the windows, which are now nothing more than holes, you can see blazing orange flames licking up and out of this block of flats.
Rachael, what do you actually remember of those first few moments after you arrived at Grenfell?
It's a big question, actually, because I think so much of my memory is affected by what I know since. I sort of remember being exhausted in the back of a cab at sort of 3 a.m. and almost turning the corner and looking to my left and seeing that tower block completely engulfed in flames. And it was just apocalyptic almost. And I think I remember getting to the scene and struggling to work out how to get closer and what was going on, and just seeing hundreds and hundreds of people all in their pyjamas, half dressed. It was a really warm summer's night, just sort of stood and just everybody looking up at that tower, just completely transfixed. And you'll know, having reported, I'm sure, on major moments, you sort of just have to crack on and do the job and try to work out what's happened, what's going on, who can we speak to. And you almost have to put into the back of your mind the human horror and the tragedy of it, while at the same time conveying that. You can't allow yourself to feel it.
I mean, I came back into London a couple of days later on the flyover that goes very close to Grenfell Tower, and you could smell it before you could see it. And then you have this charred, blackened obelisk rising out. But for us, this was a place that we knew literally in passing. For plenty of people, that was their home. And you've been reaching out again to some of those that you met that night, and specifically of their children.
Yeah, for the last 7 years, this has been a story that I have focused on repeatedly, and you build relationships with people in the days and weeks and months after a tragedy like that. And I remember doing one piece that Christmas where I spoke to a very young family. They had this beautiful little boy, and I remember him playing me Baby Shark because it was his favourite song. And it was just that surreal moment of sitting in a hotel room with this family, everything they owned, they lived in this one room. And just realising that enormous human tragedy that went well past the night of the fire itself, because these kids were going to school and coming back to a hotel room and sharing a bed with their sisters and brothers, and everything they'd owned was destroyed, and they were in clothes that were donated. And I think that's something that's really stuck with me in the years since, as I've maintained those relationships with the people who lived at Grenfell, is the way it's continued to affect them, the trauma of the night, and shaping their lives ever since.
One very young woman you've been spending time with is Luana. Tell us about her experiences that night.
So Luana was 12 at the night of the fire. She had a younger sister, and her mum was quite heavily pregnant. And Luana told me, as the older sister, she was focused on keeping her younger sister and another girl who was with the family calm. She was telling them it was going to be all right. But we know that she got stuck. They got trapped and confused and passed out in the stairwell, and rescued by complete, fantastic, fortuitous chance by a firefighter. Luana doesn't actually know the firefighter's name. She doesn't know who it was, but she was carried out of the building by a firefighter. She remembered being in the ambulance, being taken to hospital, and she was then put in a coma for a number of weeks. As was her mum, and as was her little sister. And just truly tragically for her family, when she awoke, she will have been told that her mum had suffered a stillborn birth. Her little brother Logan didn't survive, and he is officially the youngest victim of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. And so 7 years on, I really wanted to understand about how that had impacted her, and also about who she is now as she enters adulthood,
Do tell me just a little bit more about her, because, of course, there will be anxiety and there will be grief. But given the fact that she knew, was friendly with a number of people who will have lost their lives or suffered very, very serious injury as a result, I wonder if there might even be a touch of guilt in there.
Guilt is a word that she used when we spoke to her, definitely. It was quite early on in our conversation, which we had at the base of the tower. I mean, incredible bravery and strength, I think, for her to be up for opening herself up in this way. And she mentioned her neighbours, and she had a big smile on her face.
Our window faced the park down there. And every time when my friends would be there, I'd shout their names from the window.
So you'd be like, be ready in a minute.
Yeah. I don't think they would have heard me though, because I was so high up.
But you could see they were there and you think, right, time to get my shoes on.
Yeah. It was really a nice space to live and to be with people. You know, every time when I would get into the lift, you know, I would know people in the lift. I'd be like, oh, hi. And my neighbours were amazing, like all of my neighbours. We had this neighbour called Wendy, and he would always knock on our door. And yeah.
Tragically, of course, I knew that Mehdi was one of the little boys and girls who didn't survive. He died with his entire family, his brother and sister and his parents. And when I asked her about that, she broke down in tears.
Like, I sort of feel a bit guilty. You know, you just think about, I feel guilty that I'm here living and doing all this stuff when obviously they didn't get a chance to, you know, live and, you know, do stuff that they wanted to do at such a young age.
She's going to university, she's got to live her life, and so many other young people didn't. And I think all of the young people I've spoken to, there is that element too, a knowledge that it could have been them, perhaps even a sense of survivor's guilt. She also talked about suffering from anxiety, from depression. It clearly has had an impact on her. And it's been a real defining moment in her life.
And I wonder, when she looks at what happened, what does she think about responsibility? What does she think about the steps that have been taken by government since then to try and avoid incidents like this ever happening again?
I think the answer there is universal with all the children I've spoken to. For some, there was a greater sense of anger or incredulity. But for all of them, there's a real element of childhood innocence, I still think, still there, of why can't it be fixed? Why can't people in authority see what happened and have made changes? But I think at the same time, a sense of justice was also taken away from these kids, a sense that wrongs will be righted, that the bad guy will end up in prison, to put it in a really sort of child-speak way. She said at one point, I think, the phrase, it's not fair. And I think that's a really key feeling for so many of these children who just wouldn't be able to understand why, as she put it bluntly, the adults in the room couldn't change things, couldn't bring them a sense of justice, couldn't tell them who's accountable, and couldn't fix the cladding on all of these other thousands of buildings around the country. And I think there's a huge sense of fear, genuine fear, that another Grenfell will happen again.
And as we are about to discuss in some depth, those fears are very well founded. We'll be back in a minute. We were hearing from Rachael just a moment ago about those survivors' very real fears of another Grenfell Tower, because there are still buildings covered in the same or similar material to that which in 2017 led to 72 deaths, despite changes to laws and regulations. Becky Johnson is our communities correspondent. Becky, just what on earth is going on?
We all remember the horror of Grenfell and those promises over the years since from politicians that such a disaster won't happen again. And like you say, laws have changed as a result of Grenfell. But we've been around the country speaking to people who are still, 7 years on, living in buildings that have unsafe cladding or other fire risks. According to the latest government data, at least 3,280 buildings are known to still have unsafe cladding. Of course, within each of those buildings, there are dozens, potentially hundreds of people. Only 949 of those buildings have had work started on them. And for the people living inside them, it is a nightmare. And many people have been telling us that it's something that they think and worry about on a daily basis.
And I suppose part of the problem has been, perhaps as a result of some of England's kind of more archaic rules around housing and property, is that it's not immediately clear as to who is responsible for this, ultimately who should be paying for any refit. I mean, you've been speaking to someone who's had to take their building owners to court over this. Tell us about Steph and when she first discovered that there was an issue with the place that she, let's not forget, calls home.
Yeah, so Steph bought her flat in a building in Bristol in complete good faith. She didn't even think about whether it had any fire safety issues. So it was a couple of years after she moved in that surveys were done, and it became apparent that there were unsafe, potentially flammable, dangerous materials on the building and in the building where she lives. Now, it's a building that has 54 flats. And in 2023, the Building Safety Act came into force. Now, that places responsibility on building owners to replace defective materials. So Steph and one of her fellow tenants in the building actually became among the first people in the country under that act to take their building owner to court to try to force them to replace the dangerous materials on their building. December of last year, the judge ruled that the building owner should replace the materials and gave them a 6-month deadline to do so. That 6-month deadline expired in June of this year, and nothing has been done. And the many efforts made by the people who own flats in that building to contact the owners have been met with no response. And so Steph says she feels trapped because the building owner actually has to sign off on any work that will be done. So they can't get the ball rolling without the building owner being involved, and they have seemingly disappeared.
When you talk to somebody that isn't in this situation, it's actually really difficult to get across the severity of it and how it makes you feel from a mental point of view, from a financial point of view, because they just go, well, surely somebody's going to make sure they do that. Are you sure you've spoken to the right people? And you go, yeah, I've knocked on every door, we have, and they're all just shut and no one's holding account to a freeholder that still collects ground rent, still receives money and income on the building, but won't put right the defects that are there.
And the longer that they remain stumm, the longer that they fail to respond to any of these things, the longer that they don't have to put their hands in their pockets and pay for repairs to this building, which would render it safe. Have you managed to get hold of them?
No, we've been trying to contact them too, and no, we haven't. This is a company that exists. In fact, they've applied for planning permission to extend the building, but they're not responding to any form of contact. It's really quite extraordinary. But this is seemingly what's happening to people living in buildings affected. There are either building owners that are delaying carrying out work that it's their responsibility to do, or seemingly disappearing. And so people who own flats in these buildings are spending thousands of pounds on legal fees trying to track their building owner down, let alone get them to do the work.
So why doesn't she just sell up?
Well, the difficulty is, and this is partly how the existence of the unsafe materials in the building have become known about. When people try to sell, obviously potential buyers will get surveys done. And surveys then show up the existence of these unsafe materials, and that then means that no mortgage lender would lend to them. So you've got this situation where, if like Steph, you own one of these flats, you can't sell to anybody who would need a mortgage to pay for it. And she said, she's 37, she bought this flat a number of years ago as her first step on the housing ladder. She was expecting by now to be, potentially in a house with a garden, moving on with her life, she says. And for now, she just can't see how that can happen.
Everybody I speak to, their life has just kind of stopped because they can't move on to the next chapter of their lives. I should be in a house, I should be, a little garden, set of stairs, building that part of my life. And instead I'm emailing councils, I'm phoning up fire departments, I'm dealing with lenders and trying to keep the rest of the group updated. You don't use Help to Buy for your forever home. That's not how the scheme is designed. The scheme is designed to get you on the ladder, and within 5 years, you move on. And we can't do that.
As you've already outlined, Becky, hundreds of buildings still affected by this unsafe cladding material that is on them. But there are people who are living in properties adjudged by the government to be safe, who find themselves in a parallel situation to Steph, in the sense that they are struggling to get mortgages. They're struggling to be able to say that this place is safe and move on.
This affects buildings across the country. I doubt there's a town or city where there isn't somebody affected by this. It really is everywhere. Jim Illingworth, a 65-year-old man we met, who lives in a flat in Birmingham, and it's a flat that he bought with his wife to downsize as they were retiring. And you know, they thought that they would be very happy living in the centre of Birmingham. And that was until surveys found unsafe cladding on their building. Now, unlike Steph, the owner of their building did undergo quite extensive work to replace the cladding.
The building is only half safe because there is polystyrene as an insulation and everything else. Not enough to be insulation, but there to cause a fire risk. It's a B1 level. The B1, according to the government, is nice and safe. According to the insurers and the mortgage people, it's not safe.
So it's an issue with the flats not being fully separated from each other internally, which could mean that a fire could spread quite rapidly within the building. So the building's insurance is now 3 times what it was. Bear in mind he's a pensioner, so that takes a hit. But also remortgaging or a potential buyer getting a mortgage is going to really struggle. In fact, he said their local estate agent won't take on any of the flats in their building to try to sell them because they just won't sell. I have to say that for a lot of these people, they've been living with these worries for a number of years. And speaking to them, I think a lot of them have been hoping that perhaps a new government might help them or might bring some change. Now, it's still early days for the new government, but none of them have seen anything as yet that gives them reassurance that their situation is going to change anytime soon.
I suppose if there were to be a catalyst for action, it may well come in the form of that report from the Grenfell inquiry, mightn't it?
Yes, and I think people hope that that will bring about some change as well. For a lot of people, though, living in these buildings, and certainly Steph in Bristol said this to us, the best they can say is that a fire hasn't happened in their building. And everyone you speak to says, what is everyone waiting for? Is everyone waiting for another disaster like the Grenfell fire? Like, what are these building owners? What is the government? What are all the people who might have regulatory powers or powers to enforce this change? What are they waiting for before they make all the buildings in this country safe?
Becky, thanks very much. And journalists are, of course, being briefed on the contents of that inquiry report ahead of its release tomorrow. Rachael Venables is one of them. Rachael, what should we be expecting?
The report is going to tell us how the building came to be wrapped in materials which allowed that fire to spread in such a way that it overwhelmed the firefighters and that it killed 72 people. And we know that in phase 1 of the inquiry, which published its report in 2019, it focused on the night of the fire. So it was really focused on firefighters, on decisions around telling people to get out of the building, to evacuate, around the training. But it also said that the cladding was the primary cause of that rapid fire spread. And so the inquiry report is going to be very technical. There's going to be a huge amount in there about the various companies and organisations who were involved in the refurbishment of the building, which is how it came to be in that position. So the insulation, which we know was also combustible, the cladding. We're going to hear about government regulations. We're going to hear about testing regimes. I think there's going to be a long list of names and organisations who come out of this inquiry report very badly. And I think for the families who I've been speaking to in the past few days, they see this as their moment of truth. This is the moment where finally, written in black and white, they will have answers as to who is responsible, who is accountable. But obviously that doesn't end the story as far as they are concerned. One survivor said to me, we're getting truth in the inquiry. What then has to follow is change, which is a fundamental culture change in terms of the way buildings are built and the safety of these buildings with cladding around the country. And he said, then we need to see justice. And they're hoping that eventually they will see people in a courtroom at some stage.
And we will be back tomorrow taking a closer look at the final Grenfell report. Do get in touch with your thoughts. Sky News Daily at sky.uk is the email. You can find me on X and on Insta at Sky News Neil. That's your lot for today, though. We'll see you tomorrow.